What's up YouTube? You checking out the Frequent Flyer, and this is my quick review of the Warlark 80. This quad is a very nice flying quad. It's very customizable. You can hook this thing up to beta flight and clean flight and adjust your PIDs and rates and all and get it flying exactly the way you want it to fly. So it's an awesome flyer, and it has this ducted fan design. It's a tiny whoop looking quad. It actually behaves like a tiny whoop, but this thing has 7mm motors as opposed to the tiny whoop's 6mm motors, and these props here are a tad bit larger than the tiny whoop, and so this thing has considerably more power than a tiny whoop, but it keeps the small footprint just about the same size as a tiny whoop, just a little larger. As you can see, the footprint is just a little larger. So this thing might just be worthy of that moniker that everybody's trying to throw on all of their quads. It's trying to say it's a tiny whoop killer. This thing might actually be a tiny whoop killer though, because it has this ducted fan design, and so it can bump into things and continue to go. That's the whole idea of the tiny whoop. It having a very small footprint and being able to hit little tiny holes and bump into things and keep going. And this thing still has those attributes because of the small footprint that it has and this ducted fan design. This actually seems more durable than the tiny whoop frame. And this frame here it doesn't seem to be 3D printed or anything. It seems like it's cut out of a mold, like at a factory or whatnot, factory produced. So this thing is a very awesome little quadcopter. It flies really nice. I just have one problem with it, the OSD. My OSD was freezing up on me all the time. Now I saw other people complaining about the OSD freezing up on them on their reviews, and sure enough it was freezing up on me, and it even did worse. Mine is to the point now where it doesn't work anymore, but I think I figured out what's going on with it. Let me pop the canopy off, let you guys see this. Now, this here at the top, this top plate here is a VTX and OSD all built in one. And so this VTX gets very hot. So I think this VTX heats up and it actually melts the little solder points right here. I think it turns them to dry solder points, I think, because my OSD went completely out. And check this out, I figured out that you can actually pull this thing off. It's just some pins that you slide into these grooves here, so it connects by pins. And I was removing this, and you can take the camera off too, because I was using this thing as a practice vehicle for my line of sight acro and air mode and all. So I'll remove everything and, you know, reduce the weight, and I'll fly it around and practice my line of sight acro. But when I was putting this back on one day, just connecting it back together, at one point when I was pressing that one area, the OSD popped back on. So then I noticed that when I hold one of the areas in the front here on the side, the OSD comes back on. So I think that I can fix the OSD and get it back up and running. Just heat my soldering iron up and touch some of these solder points here and get the solder on it, melt it and flowing again, and I think it'll bring the OSD back. But I'm just fine without the OSD, because the OSD was causing more problems than just freezing up. It would seem like it overrides all the settings that I put in beta flight. 2 times I lost all of my settings completely fooling around with the OSD. I could never keep it up long enough for me to actually change and save anything, because when I'm going through it, it will always freeze up on me. The OSD's voltage monitoring settings are wrong. It actually thinks that it's a 2-cell in this thing, where obviously this thing is a 1S copter. And so in beta flight I would set the voltage to accordingly to a 1S. I would set everything to 1 cell, 3.7 volts per cell and all of that stuff. But once I go to flying again, the OSD would switch it back to the 2S, the 2 cell. It will still have 2 cells on it, and that OSD actually controls the copter. Like when the cell voltage gets too low, it shuts the copter down. So it was like really frustrating for me. I would fly it around a little, and then when I landed, the light on the VTX would start flashing, and this thing just wouldn't take off anymore because the OSD overrides it and shuts the copter down. So very happy to see the OSD go. I think it's half baked or whatnot. I don't know what's going on with that. But that's the only problem I had with this thing. Other than that, this is a really awesome copter. I really like the way it flies. Flies really nicely indoors, flies really nicely outdoors. It has 7mm motors as opposed to the Tiny Whoop 6mm motors. So it's a lot more powerful and all than the Tiny Whoop. And these are the stock motors that are in here. There, in other words, you can upgrade the motors to some Spintech motors, 7mm, or you can get some micro motor warehouse motors and have this thing turn into a screamer. It's already very powerful, but with those motors, a motor upgrade, I mean, come on, the Tiny Whoop, that's the main thing that people do to the Tiny Whoop is upgrade the motors. That's the first thing you have to do to get it to carry a camera. This thing carries a camera with the stock motors, and if you upgrade the motors, this thing becomes a rocket. So pretty awesome. As you can see, I did cut some of the props down, the two-bladed props, but that didn't seem to work with this. I think it'll work if you upgrade the motors to some Spintex or micro motor warehouse motors. Then the two-bladed props will work a little better. It does fly with them, but it seems like it has a little more power with the four-bladed props with these motors on it. And at this size, these props are a little larger than the Tiny Whoop's props. So thus giving this thing a lot more power overall. It comes with a 300 milliamp hour battery. And it doesn't come with an instructions manual. That's another thing. Like you can control the VTX with a button on here. I think if you long press the button, it goes into the different output voltage of the VTX. So you can get the VTX to output higher milliwatts. I think up to 600 milliwatts, but I'm not sure. It doesn't come with a manual. But pretty awesome little copter. This thing flies really well, and it comes with a linear antenna here, but you can just pop this off and put a let's see, this thing pops right off, as you can see, and you can put a clover leaf on here easy. So pretty awesome overall. This is a really nice copter. It's the Warlark 80. Thanks for watching.